Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and it's another Interview Tuesday. So I hope you had a good week and good weekend, and that your week so far is going well. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, my interview today is with Stephen Cooper, author of Valley of Shadows, which is actually the third novel in his Gus Parker and Alex Mills series. It is a mystery, a thriller, and the description is as follows. A cop, a psychic, and a dead socialite. Who killed Vivica Canning, and where is the Dolly masterpiece that hung on the wall of her estate? So many people had a motive. Phoenix detective Alex Mills is on the case with the help of his sometimes psychic buddy Gus Parker. You won't find another duo like them. And once you hop on the wild ride, you won't want to get off. Who will survive a doomed flight over the Pacific? Who tried to blow up an art gallery? Who saw Vivica Canning as a threat and shot her twice in the head? Those questions hound Gus and Alex as the case unravels. It's an art caper wrapped in a murder mystery. The Valley of the Sun becomes a Valley of Shadows, where everyone has something to hide and the truth lies beneath Phoenix in a labyrinth of tunnels and dungeons. There's a lot at stake for Gus and Alex. With the case swirling all around them, the future of Gus and his rock and roll girlfriend hangs in the balance. For Alex, it's a test of family loyalties as a health scare for his wife brings him to the breaking point. Okay, so that's the description, and it's kind of a lot, right? So there's a lot going on in this book. I love that description. It's an art caper wrapped up in a murder mystery. So you've got the element of the murder mystery. You've got the element of the stolen art. You've got the element of a police procedural in a way, with Alex being the detective. You've got Gus as the psychic. You've got relationship issues. You've got this interwoven vision that Gus keeps having of a plane going down, and what does that mean, and what is he supposed to do about it? There's all of these elements that at first glance might seem a little disparate, and yet Stephen brings them all together in this book. I like that Gus and Alex work so well together. They're friends. They're not exactly partners. It's Gus doesn't have a formal relationship with the police department, but he does work with Alex, and he is able to help him on some of his cases. This is, as I said, the third book in this series. You can read it as a standalone novel. I did, but as I was reading through it, there was definitely things I'm like, oh, I can tell that's referencing one of the first books, and I should I should read that one and get more of that story, because you get these little glimmers of what happened and how some of those relationships have evolved and things that happened in the first cases, etc. And I'm sure, as you read through those first two books, you'll get to see more of how Alex and Gus's relationship came to be in terms of their working together on these cases. So if you are a fan of mystery, if you're a fan of books with detectives or books with psychics or books with both, then you may want to check out Valley of Shadows by Stephen Cooper. But let's go ahead and get to that interview with Stephen so he can tell you more about the book and the series and writing in general.
Thank you so much for joining me for the podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
I am very happy to have you, and excited to talk about your new book, Valley of Shadows. Before we get to the book and the series, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Worst subject in the world. Talk about myself. It's hard because it's like when a book comes out, you end up talking about yourself a lot. So let me just say that I'm a former investigative reporter. I have been writing fiction for a while now. This is my third book, the third in the series, rather. And I am working on a new piece of fiction, which we can talk about later. But this is the third in the series. And like I said, I come from a journalism background. I started as a crime reporter and then became more of an investigative reporter as I moved across the country working at various news outlets. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I've been writing for a long time. And I guess if people really want to know how old I am, they can find out. You can find out anything now on the internet. So
Yep.
go have at it. But regardless of my age, I'm young at heart, as they say. I still act like a 5-year-old around the house. Which means that I'm not as disciplined about my writing as I should be, but it gets done. It gets done, so that's all that really matters.
That's amazing, because I can't imagine a 5-year-old actually finishing a novel. So you are a very progressive 5-year-old.
This 5-year-old has finished a few novels, and it's because, I do what you do to a 5-year-old, to say, if you finish writing 6,000 words today, you get a cupcake.
Oh, nice. Cupcake rewards are the best.
Absolutely.
So this book, Valley of Shadows, is the third in the Gus Parker and Alex Mills series. So since it is the third, could you just give a little bit of an overview of the series itself, maybe those first two books?
Sure. And they don't have to be really read in any specific order. They don't jump off and start and stop in any linear sort of way. But if you want more backstory and more of an established sense of place, then I would start with the first one, Desert Remains. But again, there's no real progression except for that the characters do grow and develop over time, as you would expect them to, over a course of 3 books. But the first 2 books, they take place in Phoenix, Arizona. They all take place in Phoenix, Arizona. The whole series does. But the first, 2 books really establish Phoenix as the setting and almost a character in a way. The desert and its mystery itself is established in those first 2 books. So by the time you're in the third book, you really get it. You kind of get the sort of vibe of what Phoenix is about and what the desert and its secrets are all about. So the first 2 books, like the third, pair up Alex Mills, who is a homicide detective in the Phoenix Police Department, and his good friend Gus Parker, who many people consider to be a psychic, yet Gus is not quite sure about that. I mean, he knows that he has these crazy, weird visions and this super strange intuition about things. He gets these vibes and these just bizarre notions, and they manifest. And sometimes they're helpful to Alex in Alex's investigations of crime in the valley. Sometimes they're not helpful, but they don't get to pick and choose. These visions and these vibes just happen. And then, Gus says to Alex, hey man, you might want to think about this. This is coming to me and it's really strong. And so the 2 of them team up off and on to investigate cases, homicides in the Valley of the Sun, which is how I refer and how many people refer to Phoenix. Although there's a real darkness, of course, when you talk about crime in a beautiful sunny place like Phoenix, you wouldn't expect there to be this dark underbelly. But of course, in any city, in any place across the country and around the world, there are sort of nefarious things going on. And so we sort of plunge into those stories about murder and mayhem. And these 2 guys are really my main protagonists throughout the stories as they uncover different clues and hints and try to track the killers down.
Mm-hmm. And so this third book is called Valley of Shadows. Is that in juxtaposition to, the people calling it the Valley of the Sun?
It is, in a way. It was certainly my intention to put it out there that sometimes the darkest things happen in the brightest places, right? And that's sort of the idea. And I think it works because when I lived out there, it was gorgeous every day, and yet I was a reporter covering crime, and there's no way that you cover crime and not sense the gathering darkness of humanity when you're looking at body bags and watching techs do their measurements on a crime scene. It really makes you think twice about humanity. And so, this is a long way to answer your question. The book that's coming out in a couple of weeks very much is that juxtaposition.
Okay. So what was your inspiration for this story?
Well, I think I've always been somewhat fascinated by how money and power can corrupt. And I say can corrupt because it doesn't always corrupt. This is not a cliche or a stereotype that I'm talking about. But in many cases, I think we think of crime as, down and dirty and gritty and sort of in a lower level of society and sort of the underbelly. But sometimes, some of the most heinous crimes are committed by the most powerful and wealthy and influential people in a society. And I've always been fascinated by how, the media portrays certain criminals versus, other criminals. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that, when you look at the average newscast in America and you see, crime, it often focuses on the minority population and what's going on in their neighborhoods. And I guess I'm here to say it happens in all neighborhoods. It happens in some of the most, some of the wealthiest, some of the socially higher climbing neighborhoods in our culture. It's just that I think it tends to get kind of glamorized rather than treated in much the same way that your everyday crime gets treated. It's considered sensational when it happens to wealthy people. Where you know what, murder is murder, crime is crime, death is death. It doesn't really matter what's in your checking account.
Right. And I don't know if the recording picked it up, but I do have to say that it was very appropriate that there was a siren going off behind you while you were talking about crime.
That's right. I live in the big city, man. It's like sirens.
It was perfect timing.
And you know what? It doesn't even, to me, I don't even hear it. I honestly, I don't even hear it because of all the cities that I've lived in across the country and of all the crime I covered, it's just like a wash to me.
Yeah, I bet it is. You have mentioned Alex and Gus, who are the main characters of the series. What about them do you think might resonate with readers?
I think what resonates mostly with readers, and I'm telling you what I've heard from readers. Okay, I mean, I know that when I work with these guys, I really do hope that they resonate with readers as just regular people. But that's what I'm hearing back from readers as well, that these are guys that they can relate to because they're just regular guys. Alex is a cop, but he's also a family man. He's not one of those cliches, sort of the jaded, crusty cop who drinks too much and can't keep his marriage together. He's the opposite. He's a really good husband. And he's a really good father, and he has all those challenges of family life alongside the challenges of being, a detective and performing in that role. He's just, a regular guy dealing with, he pays taxes, and he, has to pay for his kids' college tuition. And Gus is like this aging surfer dude. I say that acknowledging the fact that there's not a lot of surfing to do in the desert, but he spent a lot of time in Southern California before he moved to the desert, and so he spent a lot of time on the ocean. And so he still thinks like a surfer guy. He's still very much, low key, laid back, very kind of zen about most things. And so they work really well off each other. And I think that resonates with readers. Their teamwork is a sort of yin and yang, and each of them are very accessible as people because there's just sort of a realness to them, even though Gus has a very unreal aspect to him with his visions and his gifts that seem really out there. He's a very regular guy. He holds down another job.
I'm going to jump in here so we can take our first break of the podcast, but I just wanted to follow up on what Stephen was saying about Gus being a regular guy, and he is a regular guy. I mean, he's a regular guy who happens to also have some psychic abilities, but even Gus is not quite sure what he's supposed to do with those or what he's supposed to make of those. I really appreciated that he wasn't necessarily just a caricature of someone who's supposed to be psychic in this book, but he is presented as a complete character, a complete person. And I really did, as I said, appreciate that about his character. So we are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll be talking more about Valley of Shadows with Stephen Cooper. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Stephen Cooper about his new thriller, Valley of Shadows. Before the break, we were talking about the two main characters, Alex Mills and Gus Parker, and how they both bring their unique set of skills and gifts to the series, to the cases that they work on, but that they are at heart just regular guys. So let's go ahead and turn back to that interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that they are regular guys. They're also not often in books. The average age of the main character is like 28 or so, and these guys are not 28. They're a little older. They're a little more established, and so they come to their work and their characters with different issues. I know in a previous book there were issues with Alex's son, and I haven't read it, but I know that was mentioned somewhere on your website. So, they bring their issues with family and circumstances with them.
They're not going through their 20s with a lot of, this is not about that kind of angst, right? Alex is very much, he's in that part of his life. He's in his 40s, and, he just, nothing really phases him, and Gus, he has a little angst about his visions because he's not sure quite what to do with them all the time. But he's pretty, he's pretty cool with himself. Nothing really rattles him either.
Mm-hmm.
Except when he's being stalked. When he's being stalked, that's a little creepy.
Well, I would hope that would rattle him a little bit, yeah. How have the characters evolved through the series?
Well, I think they've gotten used to each other. They're a team in a way. They're friends. And so their friendship has deepened profoundly over the course of the 3 books. And it's a friendship that I enjoy because I know what that's like to develop a friendship with somebody and watch it over the years deepen and become more meaningful, where words don't need to be spoken. You kind of just know where the other person is coming from. I think that, Alex, you can see him develop from that person who, felt really at odds with his superiors and, all that pressure, to a guy who really is very confident and doesn't take a lot of, bull from, the people in the department. He's his own person, but that doesn't happen overnight. That happens over the course of the 3 books. And with Gus, I think his growth is seen through his relationship with this woman, Billy Welsh, and how he approaches these romantic ties, something he's never been all that successful with, because he's kind of in his own world. And so naturally he chooses a woman who's kind of in her own world, right? And through the progression of the 3 books, you see the learning curve of their relationship, and it does change him.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. In terms of the book and the story, what kinds of research did you do?
Well, I always reach out to homicide people when I'm writing crime fiction, which is what I'm writing primarily. And so I'm in touch with certain detectives, both in the city that I live in now and in Phoenix, because it's one thing to understand sort of the generics of crime, but every agency and every department and every, municipality behaves a little different procedurally. And since the books are sort of police procedurals, that you want to get those facts correct. So I have conversations with people in the Phoenix Police Department to make sure that, as much as I'm writing fiction, that enough of it is true to true procedure. I have met with people who profess to have psychic abilities to find out how they work and to figure out how to best apply some of that practice to Gus's own. I refer back to a lot of the cases that I covered in my own work as a crime reporter, understanding how the judicial system works and how, the relationship between law enforcement, specifically police departments and district attorneys, and how cases get funneled up and referred up and how they make their way through the court system. So I still have a problem throwing away old case files that I have from my reporting days, but they're really helpful. I can look back and really understand how cases, unfold.
Mm-hmm. And you've talked a little bit about this, but you mentioned that you've lived in multiple cities. Can you talk about why you chose Phoenix specifically for this series?
Well, first of all, when I lived out in Phoenix and worked out there, I think the atmosphere had a profound effect on me because, it's very scenic in a stark kind of way. And the way that Phoenix looks from a distance, from any distance, wherever you are looking out, it's kind of mysterious because there are all these mountains and these ranges and the craggy peaks and different times of the day that shadows are cast off these mountains in different ways. And it just is sort of felt like the perfect place for a mystery, and the desert itself like the perfect place to dump bodies because the desert is so vast and, you never know where the next body is going to end up, right? And particularly with the first book, which, really worked with some of the mystery I stumbled upon in the desert in the name of these ancient petroglyphs that were carved into the caves and the mountains by, the Native Americans of hundreds of years ago, these art renditions from so long ago that I was stumbled upon in my hikes. The petroglyphs of the desert themselves inspired the first book, Desert Remains, which is very much driven by the mystery of those petroglyphs and why a serial killer is using these ancient drawings as the inspiration for his murders. So I think that answers your question, like why the series started in Phoenix, because That was something I really wanted to use as a source. And so I found that I didn't write, I mean, I should just say right now, I didn't write this first book to be a series. I wrote it as a standalone. Desert Remains was, in my head, a standalone. But my publisher liked the way that the desert was established in the story as a real character, as a real necessary part of the story. The publisher liked the atmosphere that was created. So I was asked to create a series from the first book. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. And besides having lived in Phoenix, are there any particular autobiographical elements in the book or the characters?
Not really. I don't think so. I think that in all the books, I spend a little time throwing shade at the media. And I do that sort of autobiographically because as a former television reporter, I'm very thankful for the career that I had and very grateful for a lot of things that I learned, but I also regret some of the stupid gimmicks and crazy crap that went on in TV news. And so I don't spare the industry at all in these books. I autobiographically, make some statements about the way television news works. And also, I guess I could say that autobiographically, I think Gus is a little bit like me. We are not easily rattled. We both are very much driven by a spiritual kind of sensibility. When I think about crime and I think about murder, I don't just think about blood and guts. I mean, there's plenty of blood and guts in my books, but when I think about murder and crime, I think about more the mind, the criminal mind, like what the hell is going on in someone's mind that would prompt them or motivate them to create or to commit such heinous acts of violence. So I think that there's a little bit of me and Gus.
Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. What are you working on right now?
Right now, I'm working on a standalone book, which is like a little departure from Gus and Alex. Gus and Alex are just asking me for a little time off. I was like, okay, guys, you got it. No problem.
Stop nagging me.
Exactly. You deserve it. It's been 3 books. You got it. But I thought that, now that I live in Atlanta, I should challenge myself to write here in this atmosphere. I should challenge myself to try to bring Atlanta alive in a piece of crime fiction. Now, of course, this book might never see the light of day. And that's what I think the truth is for all writers. I don't know how I don't know what other writers tell you, but the truth is that so many times you have an idea for a book and you start writing, and it may never make it to publication because it just might not work or it might not be the right time. But right now, for me, it's the project, and it's another piece of crime fiction that takes place in Atlanta, and it centers around a detective who's struggling to track down a killer who is kind of leaving a lot of question marks about how people in our modern culture are dealing with racial issues and problems. And this story, I think, in a way, I think this story draws on some of the contemporary issues that we're having with race in our country now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a very timely piece.
It could be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, and hopefully Alex and Gus have themselves a nice vacation because there's been a lot of murder and stuff, and they need a break.
Thank you. I think so too. And I'll give them the time off, and then I'm sure we'll all get back together again for another case.
They just need some space, Stephen. They just leave them alone.
Gus himself, I mean, he'd like to get back to Southern California and do some surfing. So got to let him do that.
Sure.
Because even fictional characters need breaks too sometimes, clearly. Speaking of breaks, we are going to take our second break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll have the conclusion to my interview with Stephen Cooper. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Parker and Alex Mills series that is a mystery and a thriller. So let's go ahead and get back to the conclusion of that interview.
You were a reporter, a journalist. So when did you start writing fiction, and what kind of inspired you to do so?
Well, okay, so I've been writing fiction for a very long time. I wrote it throughout my whole career as a journalist. It was, in many ways, this is going to sound so pompous and arrogant. It was my salvation. But the truth is that it was really my way of coping with all the blood and the guts I was seeing in real life on the streets.
Sure.
So I would go home every night after work and create my own worlds where I could control the crime and I could, make choices for people and how they dealt with the crime on the streets, and how the cases found their way to the courts, and how cops track down evidence. I was informed very much by my career, but the writing that I would do at home, the creative writing, was really, it's so cliche, but it was an escape from that. There's no other way to describe it. It was just a healthy way for me to get all this stuff out of my system. And but even prior to that, I've been writing my whole life. I mean, even as a kid, right? I remember writing stories all through, my childhood, and I just thought it was fun because I loved reading. I always loved reading, and I always said to myself, I want to do this someday. I want to write stories for people.
Okay. And so what was the impetus, or what prompted you then to get some of your works published, go that route?
I remember when I was a younger reporter at one of my first jobs. This is the truth. This is like a story that I treasure, because I came into the newsroom one day and this woman was sitting at my desk who I did not recognize. And so I asked my assignment desk people, who's that? And why is she at my desk? And they said, oh, she's a writer and she's working on a book where like one of her characters is going to be a reporter. And so she asked to shadow a reporter today. So we assigned her to you.
Oh,
And
cool.
I said, oh, okay, well, sure. So I walked over and introduced myself. And she said, would you like to have your desk back? And I said, no, we're going out on the road. You're going to shadow me. We're going to go out on the road. I spent the day with this woman. And so she was trying to learn how reporting works, you know, how just the whole stream, the whole work stream, like how you gather your story and your interviews and how you put it together and how you meet your deadline and all that stuff. And I was learning from her, like, what the hell is publishing all about? Like, how do you get a book published? And like, what does it really take to be a published writer? And so she and I, from that day forward, became the best of buddies. Like our friendship transcended any of this, you know, stuff between her needing me and me needing her. It just, we became really good buddies and we commiserated for almost our lifetime now. We're still very, very close. She's written her stuff. I've written my stuff. But, you know, that was really a big turning point for me, was meeting somebody who was actually doing it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. That is a very cool story.
And her name is Jean Stone, and she writes lovely stories that take place on Martha's Vineyard.
Okay, I was going to ask, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to, you know, mention her name, so thank you for that.
A little plug for Jean.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Out of your personal journey through writing, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
You know, I see a lot of advice on social media these days. Like it seems like every day somebody else has some advice for someone. And I think my biggest piece of advice for aspiring writers is be careful of how much advice you take. Because it can really thwart you. I think if you're on social media seeking advice or looking for advice too often, it can really take over your work. And I think some of your work has to be done really organically. Like, I think you got to throw it out there, you know, on the canvas or the potter's wheel and see what you do with it first before you start asking for a lot of advice. Like, you have a story idea in mind, sit down and write it. And on your next draft or your third draft, then worry about getting the advice to make it publication worthy. Because I think that with the kind of advice that I'm seeing out there, like, don't do this, don't do that, adverbs are horrible. You know, I think just too much of that gets in the way. I would say, read a lot. You know, particularly the genre that you're writing in, you need to be reading that genre. You need to be understanding how good stories are told. And you can never read too much. So absolutely read. And I would also say, don't be so hard on yourself. I see a lot of struggling writers who post on social media. For some reason, there's a lot of depression and angst among writers on social media. And I think y'all just being too hard on yourselves. You know, if the thing isn't coming together, write something else, even for a day. I'm not saying abandon your project. Don't abandon your project. But if it's not working, that means that you need to, you know, spend a day writing about your batty Aunt Betty who, you know, can't stop drinking and cursing, you know, or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like just capture something else and then go back to your work. Don't get so caught up in the roadblocks that you perceive are hampering your work that you hamper yourself. Just get away from it. And I don't know, I just say, don't be so hard on yourself and trust your instincts. But I got to say, I'm going to repeat myself. Read, be reading. I read every night. I read every night before bed. And, you know, it's just great to keep being exposed to other work and other work that works.
Yeah. I would now very much like for you to write a short story called My Batty Aunt Betty, please.
Who says I haven't?
Okay, well, I'll read it.
I'll remember that.
And back to your comments on social media, that social media and the internet are great, but you can find something to contradict everything you find. So if you find a piece of advice that seems to make sense to you, you can go on the next day and find the exact opposite piece of advice. And
Exactly.
I think it can just get overwhelming.
Exactly.
But you mentioned reading. So I guess do you have favorite authors or genres? What are you reading now? All those good nosy reading questions.
I have really eclectic tastes. Like I'll read anything, I'll read anything as long as it holds my attention and I enjoy the writing. So I mix it up a lot between fiction and nonfiction. I feel like some of the best nonfiction, what makes it best is that it feels like a novel. I love nonfiction that is so well crafted that it feels like a novel. So I bounce back and forth, but as someone who writes crime, I enjoy Dennis Lehane. I enjoy C.J. Box. I grew up in Boston, so I grew up reading Robert B. Parker. I was really, sort of spoiled by reading about cases that took place in my own backyard as a kid. I love that. And for the classics, I always recommend Chandler and Hammett. But there's some great contemporary writers too, like I just mentioned, and James Iskin, whose work I love, the Ellie Stones series. And Hank Philippi Ryan, who's a friend, and she writes some terrific Boston-based books also. I have very, very eclectic taste. Right now, I'm not reading crime fiction at all. Right now I'm reading, that's not true. I'm reading two books right now. I'm reading Hank's new book, The Murder List. I'm also reading the biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Oh, okay. Who, if you want to go back to the internet themes, people are hoping will live forever.
Right. Well, she basically has to.
Yeah. I keep seeing all these different memes about her living forever. But speaking of social media, do you have a website, and where can people find you on social media?
So people can find me a few different places. My website is stephencooperbooks.com, which I just updated with a new trailer for my book. On Facebook, I'm at Stephen Cooper Author. And on Twitter, I'm at the Stephen Cooper. Not just any Stephen Cooper. I'm the Stephen Cooper on Twitter.
You are the only one.
Apparently.
A definitive article. All right.
That's right.
I like it. So we've talked about the series. We've talked about writing. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you would like to just put out there for people to know about writing or your books or anything at all?
Well, I think that I'm not somebody, I take my writing very seriously, obviously. I have an agent who makes sure of that. I send things to her and she makes me work. She really makes me take my work seriously. But I'm not someone who takes myself so seriously. And I noticed about, was it a year ago? We're in 2019. This is me being brilliant. We're in 2019. I think it was last year. I went away for like 10 or 12 days without my laptop. And I had a little separation anxiety because it really meant detaching and not working and not writing. And I bring this up because I think that I learned the importance of unplugging. When I came back from that vacation, I was really ready to get back to work and to start fresh. I felt energized and I felt inspired. But that I had never really trusted myself without some kind of attachment to some sort of device where I could, record my thoughts and, or work on a book. I used to write on planes all the time, but this trip, we went away and I unplugged, and it was a daring move on my part. So I came back thinking, like, this is what you need to do every so often. Like, this is really important. And I recommend it. I recommend for all the people who are out there stressing over whatever work they're doing that, sometimes you just have to walk away and get some new perspective. And so I really, I think that's a big part of what I bring to my writing is that I now bring to my writing the idea of freedom and, just a way to find your zen, I guess. I know a lot of people are going to be rolling their eyes when they hear me say this, but I kind of think that, we struggle so much in our daily lives, regardless of what our professions are. We all go to work, get up in the morning, we rush breakfast, we get out there, we go to work, and we're not necessarily all that present with what we're doing, but we just get through it. We get through it, and we're attached to every device in the world, and we're on social platforms. And this is a very long answer to your very short question. But my point is that I think in this day that we're living in that's so digital and so, high tech, that it's really good to go low tech. It's really good every so often just to go low tech.
Mm-hmm. And, we've been talking lots about social media, and then you don't have all those social media voices blathering at you either. So, yeah, I can definitely see the advantage of that.
Well, I think it's helped me as a writer also because I've gotten to see the world with a great pair of eyes that are really only focused on the world and not on a device and not on, I when we go away, I say, no posting. Like, we're not those people who post on Facebook, oh, here we are, at Machu Picchu. I was like, we can wait until we get home and post our vacation photos when we get home. We don't need to do it in the moment because that means we're not in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's what I'm saying.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Stephen, for joining me, taking the time to talk about the Gus and Alex series, and especially the new book, which comes out when?
September 17th, so you can pre-order it now, Valley of Shadows.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Sarah, thank you. This has been terrific.
Thank you once again to Stephen for taking the time to speak with me about his book. It turns out that he actually wasn't feeling all that great when we talked over the weekend. So I think he did an amazingly good job of being engaged and engaging while not feeling well, as opposed to when I don't feel well and I sound like I am going through puberty. You've all heard me when I have a cold. It's lovely. At any rate, thank you to Stephen. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to talk about your book. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I appreciate you more than you can ever know. The fact that you're out there in the world, fellow book lovers, it just makes my heart happy to know that you are out there wherever you may be. So I hope you're having a great week. I hope that you will join me again for the next episode of the GSMC Book Review Podcast. But in the meantime, I hope that you have time to go out there and get yourself lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.GSMC.com. GSMCpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.